My name is Rosemary Cole. I'm 26 years old, and my life just became a calculated battlefield. I was sitting at the dinner table in our Reno home, the dry Nevada heat still clinging to the walls when my father slammed a printed document onto the glass surface. He didn't ask, he commanded. Pay us $1,600 in rent starting tomorrow, or pack your bags and get out. We've supported your career long enough. My mother sat there wiping fake tears, sobbing about rising medical bills and the sacrifices they made, while my older sister and aunt stared at me with predatory smiles, nodding in agreement. They knew I was drowning in $52,000 of student debt, working 10-hour shifts as an insurance underwriter just to keep my head above water. To them, I wasn't a daughter. I was a financial bailout for their failing lifestyle. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I looked at the bold underlined numbers on that contract, felt the cold betrayal in my chest, and simply smiled back. I'll sign, I said calmly, but I need to keep the original in my room tonight to review the tax deduction clauses. I'll give it back in the morning. They thought they had finally broken me. They thought they had secured their $1,600 paycheck. What they didn't know was that I was leaving that very night. And I wasn't just taking my clothes, I was taking the very soul of this house with me. If you think this family's demands are absolutely insane, hit that subscribe button right now and leave a comment below to stand with me. Your support helps me bring more of these high-stakes stories to life. The heavy silence of the house at 10 p.m. felt more like a suffocating shroud than a sanctuary as I pushed my bedroom door shut and turned the deadbolt with a decisive click. My fingers were trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the icy surge of adrenaline that always accompanied a high-stakes investigation at my insurance firm. Sitting at my desk, the only light in the room came from the cold blue glow of my laptop screen, casting long skeletal shadows against the walls, while the rhythmic mechanical clicking of my keyboard became the only soundtrack to my rebellion. I navigated directly to annualcreditreport.com with a sense of impending doom, knowing that in the world of risk assessment, intuition was rarely wrong, and the numbers were the only truth-tellers left in this house. When the screen finally refreshed to display my FICO credit score, the air vanished from my lungs as if I had been struck in the chest, staring at a number that had plummeted into a disastrous abyss. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird while I scrolled through the detailed transaction history, my eyes burning as I unearthed the first layer of a betrayal so deep it felt like a physical wound. My father, Terrance Cole, whom I had trusted with my Social Security number for what I thought were legitimate tax purposes, had forged my signature to secure a high-interest loan for a brand-new Cadillac CT5. I watched the monthly payment figures glare back at me, $1,200, realizing that while I was eating ramen to pay off my student debt, he was cruising through the streets of Reno in a luxury vehicle financed by my future. However, the rabbit hole went even deeper into the darkness when I stumbled upon another staggering liability linked to my identity. A $15,000 personal loan had been guaranteed in my name through a high-interest predatory lender, a shadowy fund often frequented by those whose luck had run dry at the tables. It took me only a few seconds to connect the dots to my 30-year-old sister Serena Cole, whose secret addiction to the blackjack tables at the pepper mill had finally found a way to consume my life as well as her own. The realization that my own flesh and blood had systematically dismantled my financial credibility to fuel their vanity and vices sent a shiver of absolute cold through my veins. In that moment of total devastation, something inside me shifted, a brittle part of my soul hardening into diamond-sharp resolve, because I realized that tears were a luxury I could no longer afford. I did not let a single drop fall. Instead, I focused every ounce of my professional training on neutralizing the threat that my parents and sister had become to my survival. With a cold surgical precision, I initiated a total credit freeze, with the three major bureaus Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion effectively locking my financial identity behind an impenetrable digital vault. I watched the confirmation screens flicker by, knowing that by morning any further attempt by my father to exploit my name would be met with an immediate humiliating rejection from the banks. The final piece of my immediate defense required a level of logistical coordination that only one person could provide in such a short window of time. I pulled out my phone and composed a cryptic, urgent message to my boyfriend Brooks Briggs, a man whose steady presence had been the only thing keeping me sane during these long months of living under Terrance's roof. The contract was a smokescreen for something much worse. Plan 1130 is a go. Bring your Ford F-150 to the back gate. No lights, no horn, just be there. I typed my thumb hovering over the send button for a heartbeat before I committed to the path of no return. As the sent notification appeared, I felt the final tether to this house snap, replaced by a fierce protective instinct for the life I was about to reclaim from the ashes of their greed. I spent the remaining minutes methodically clearing my desk of every shred of evidence, ensuring that my laptop and essential documents were packed into my waterproof tactical bag. Every movement was calculated, every breath measured as I prepared to descend into the quiet halls of a home that had become a prison ready to reclaim the technology and services that had been subsidizing their comfort at the cost of my soul. The glowing clock on my nightstand ticked toward the midnight hour each second, bringing me closer to the moment I would leave the shadows of Reno behind for a world where I was no longer a commodity to be traded. 11:30 p.m. arrived with a heavy pulsating silence that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards as I stepped out of my room, moving with the ghostly stealth of someone who no longer belonged in their own home. I moved barefoot across the cold hardwood of the hallway, the familiar textures of the house feeling alien beneath my skin as I navigated the darkness with practiced precision. Every creak of the timber felt like a thunderclap in the midnight stillness, a reminder of the treacherous ground I was walking on, while my family slept soundly, oblivious to the fact that their world was about to go dark. The air in the corridor was thick with the scent of stale vanilla and expensive cigars, a lingering ghost of Dad's afternoon celebration that now only served to fuel the cold fire of resolve burning in my chest. I reached the living room, where the small, blinking blue lights of the electronic devices flickered like the eyes of tiny sentinels, unaware that I was about to strip them of their purpose. My first target was the high-performance Wi-Fi 6 router and its expansive mesh system, a sophisticated network I had personally invested $500 in to ensure my professional remote work remained flawless. I knelt on the floor, my fingers working with surgical grace, as I unplugged the glowing white monolith, effectively severing the invisible umbilical cord that connected this house to the outside world. There was a profound, almost spiritual satisfaction in watching those lights fade into blackness, knowing that the digital lifeline Serena used to fuel her gambling habits was now resting dead in my tactical bag. I moved systematically to the Smart Hub Central Unit, the hidden brain of the household that I had painstakingly programmed to manage every convenience from the automated lighting to the climate control systems. By removing this small, unassuming plastic box, I was essentially lobotomizing the house, turning their high-tech sanctuary into an unpredictable, unmanageable shell of its former self. The Nest thermostat flickered once before losing its connection, its circular screen turning into a vacant gray eye that would no longer obey the commands of a family that saw me only as a paycheck. I moved toward the front entrance, reaching up to silence the Ring security sensors that were registered exclusively under my name and paid for by my exhausted labor every single month. These devices were meant to protect the inhabitants of this home, yet they had failed to protect me from the financial predators who slept just a few dozen feet away in the master bedroom. Each sensor I pulled from its mount felt like I was reclaiming a piece of my stolen dignity, stripping away the layers of comfort I had provided for people who chose to forge my signature rather than show me respect. The darkness in the house deepened as the automated nightlights failed to trigger, leaving the hallway in a primitive obsidian gloom that mirrored the current state of my relationship with the Cole name. When I returned to my bedroom for the final time, the sight of the stripped mattress and the absence of my personal belongings hit me with a wave of bittersweet finality that nearly stole my breath. I gathered my waterproof tactical bag, my laptop, and the heavy folder containing the forged document standing in the center of the room that had been my only refuge for the past 4 years. The space felt cavernous and unnervingly cold, the silence echoing against the bare walls as if the room itself were mourning the departure of its only honest occupant. I didn't feel like a thief. I felt like a recovery agent reclaiming property from a debtor who had defaulted on the most basic terms of human decency and familial love. I cast one last look at the empty shelves where my childhood memories used to sit, realizing that I was leaving behind more than just furniture. I was abandoning the illusion of a family that never truly existed. I slipped out through the heavy kitchen door, the humidity of the Reno night wrapping around me like a damp blanket as I made my way toward the shadows of the back gate. Brooks was waiting exactly where he promised, the idling engine of his Ford F-150, a low, reassuring growl that sounded like the first heartbeat of my new independent life. He didn't say a word as he took my bags, his hand squeezing mine with a silent strength that told me he understood the magnitude of the bridge I was currently burning. As I climbed into the passenger seat and looked back at the darkened silhouette of the house, I didn't see a home, but a decaying monument to greed and manipulation. I felt a strange, soaring sense of weightlessness as the truck pulled away from the curb, leaving the ghosts of Terrance, Glenda, and Serena behind, in a house that was about to become very cold, very quiet, and very lonely. 1:00 a.m. arrived as a blur of flickering amber lights and long, distorted shadows as I sat in the passenger seat of the Ford F-150, watching the familiar skyline of Reno diminish in the rearview mirror. Brooks kept his hand steady on the steering wheel, his profile illuminated by the soft green glow of the dashboard as we accelerated onto the I-80 highway heading south, the tires humming a low, mournful tune against the cold asphalt. The desert wind whipped against the glass, a stark reminder of the harsh reality I was leaving behind. Yet my mind was far from peaceful as I pulled my smartphone from my pocket. My hands were no longer trembling. Instead, they moved with a calculated rhythmic precision that mirrored the cold insurance underwriter I had become over the years of surviving Terrance's constant demands. I looked down at the screen, the harsh brightness reflecting in my tired eyes, knowing that while I had physically escaped the house, the invisible chains of financial obligation were still coiled tightly around my neck. My first act of digital severance began with the AT&T mobile application, a portal through which I had provided the digital lifeblood of the Cole household for over 2 years without a single word of gratitude. I navigated through the administrative settings of our fiber optic internet account, an elite high-speed connection that Serena had used relentlessly to fuel her secret late-night blackjack sessions, while Mom binged expensive home shopping channels. With a single decisive tap, I selected the command to suspend the service immediately, imagining the sudden jarring darkness that would soon greet them in the morning when their devices failed to connect. There was a hollow ache in my chest, as I realized I was systematically dismantling the comfort of people I once loved, but that pain was quickly overshadowed by the memory of the forged signatures on those Cadillac loan documents. I didn't stop there. I moved directly to the family plan settings, where I initiated a permanent separation of my primary line from the rest of the household group. By migrating my number to an independent encrypted carrier, I left Dad, Mom, and Serena stranded on a plan that would now revert to individual non-discounted rates that were nearly triple the cost of our previous arrangement. As the truck roared through the dark Nevada landscape, I logged into the Nevada Energy Portal, the gateway to the basic utilities that kept their sanctuary illuminated and warm against the desert chill. I stared at the stored credit card information, the 16 digits of my own hard-earned savings that had been fueling their autopay system for as long as I could remember. I felt a surge of bitter clarity as I removed my payment methods and canceled the automatic billing cycle, knowing that while the lights wouldn't go out tonight, the massive, unassisted bill arriving at the end of the month would be a catastrophic wake-up call for Terrance. It felt like I was stripping away the protective layers of a house that had become a predatory environment, forcing them to finally feel the weight of the expenses they had so casually offloaded onto my shoulders. Every confirmation pop-up on my screen felt like another link in my cage, snapping each digital click a heartbeat of a woman finally reclaiming the fruits of her own labor. The final, most devastating blow required me to access the insurance underwriting portal, where I managed the policies I had foolishly extended to cover the family's expanding fleet of luxuries. I found the active policy for the Cadillac CT5, the very vehicle Dad had acquired by stealing my credit identity, and I initiated an immediate cancellation of the comprehensive coverage I had been subsidizing. By removing the insurance, I was effectively turning that luxury sedan into a legal liability, ensuring that the moment Dad pulled onto a public road, he would be operating a vehicle without the protection required by Nevada law. It was a cold, surgical strike, but it was the only way to protect my own professional license from being tarnished by the fraudulent debt they had tethered to my name. I leaned my head back against the seat, the cool air from the vents blowing against my skin as the finality of my actions began to settle into the marrow of my bones. Brooks glanced over at me, his eyes filled with a quiet, somber respect that didn't need words to convey his support for the brutal path I had chosen to take. I looked at the dark, expansive horizon, realizing that I had spent my entire adult life trying to be the anchor for a ship that was determined to sink, and all I had achieved was nearly drowning myself in the process. The silence in the cabin was no longer heavy with grief, but was instead filled with the raw, terrifying potential of a future where I was no longer a resource to be consumed. I watched the stars above the desert, distant and unreachable, feeling a strange, blooming sense of peace, as I realized that for the first time in 26 years, I was truly invisible to the predators I shared a name with. The digital world I had built for them was now a void, and as the truck sped further away from the shadows of Reno, I finally allowed myself to breathe without the weight of their expectations crushing my ribs. 6:00 a.m. arrived with a relentless golden glare as the Nevada sun began its daily assault on the high desert, casting long, harsh shadows across the silent halls of the house. I could almost imagine the air growing heavy and stagnant inside those walls as the heat began to seep through the insulation, a slow building pressure that mirrored the impending financial collapse I had set in motion. Terrance was the first to stir in the master bedroom, his routine as mechanical as the insurance policies I once managed, driven by an insatiable need to check the early morning betting lines and market fluctuations. He reached out with a heavy, confident hand to grab the television remote from the nightstand, expecting the familiar flicker of the financial news to illuminate his morning. But instead, he was met with a defiant, glowing box of text. The screen displayed a cold, unyielding connection error message that signaled the death of the high-speed sanctuary I had provided for him for far too long. He clicked the buttons repeatedly, a frantic rhythmic tapping that echoed in the quiet room, unable to accept that the digital umbilical cord had been severed while he slept. The absence of the Wi-Fi signal was only the first layer of the technological paralysis that was about to transform the Cole residence into a primitive, suffocating cage. Because I had reclaimed the central smart hub in the middle of the night, the sophisticated brain of the household had vanished, leaving the expensive HVAC system and the water heating units completely lobotomized. The air conditioning vents, which usually hummed with a consistent cool vitality, remained eerily silent as the indoor temperature began to climb toward the 80-degree mark within minutes of sunrise. Without the digital scheduling I had programmed, the house began to bake under the Reno sun like a forgotten kiln, the stagnant air becoming thick with the scent of leather and desperation. My father likely stood in the center of the living room staring at the vacant gray eye of the Nest thermostat, realizing for the first time that his comfort was not a birthright, but a service provided by the daughter he had chosen to exploit. The fragile silence of the morning was shattered by a piercing, hysterical shriek from the guest wing, where Serena had finally awoken to find her digital world in ruins. I pictured her frantically swiping at her smartphone, her eyes widening in disbelief, as the status bar remained stubbornly fixed on the no service notification I had initiated from the highway. For someone whose entire existence revolved around secret blackjack groups and social media vanity, the loss of her primary communication line was a psychological amputation. She would have been pacing her room, her voice rising in a crescendo of vulgarity, as she realized she was cut off from the gambling associate she owed money to, unable to even place a call to demand an explanation. Her world had become a vacuum, a silent void where her influence was zero, and her ability to manipulate others through a screen had been stripped away by the very sister she had mocked just hours before. While the chaos erupted between Terrance and Serena, Mom likely sat at the kitchen island, her hands trembling as she opened her laptop to find a digital massacre waiting in her primary inbox. Glenda would have been greeted by a flood of automated alerts from every major service provider we used, each subject line a hammer blow to the family's fragile sense of security. The notifications from the insurance carriers and the utility companies were blunt and final, informing her that the payment methods had been removed and the comprehensive policies were no longer active. She would have watched the screen in a state of catatonic shock, seeing the financial fortress I had built for them crumble into a heap of unmanaged liabilities and looming debts. The realization that even the Cadillac sitting in the driveway was now an uninsured legal hazard probably felt like a physical weight pressing down on her chest, a stark contrast to the pampered lifestyle she had enjoyed at my expense. Finally, the three of them would have gathered at the door of my bedroom, a final desperate pilgrimage to find the source of their sudden misfortune and demand an immediate restoration of their luxuries. Terrance likely threw the door open with the force of a man accustomed to having his way, his face red with a mixture of heat and burgeoning fury, only to be met with a sight that probably chilled his blood. My room was a vacant, echoing shell of its former self, stripped of every personal item and every electronic comfort I had ever brought into that house. There was no sign of my existence left behind save for the ban-hop Jongbise knot scattered across the bare floor like confetti from a funeral for our relationship. The cold finality of the empty space was the loudest statement I could have ever made, a silent declaration that the daughter they had treated as a commodity was gone forever, leaving them alone in a house that was now just a collection of lifeless walls and unpaid bills. Monday at high noon brought a brutal, shimmering heatwave to Reno as the outside temperature skyrocketed to 100 degrees Fahrenheit, turning the uncooled Cole residence into a stifling, airless tomb. My aunt Celia Cole, who had been the most vocal supporter of the rent agreement during our tense dinner just 18 hours ago, arrived at the front door with an expectant, greedy glow in her eyes. She had been the one to whisper in Dad's ear about how much an insurance underwriter like me could afford to give, and she was clearly here to see if her manipulative advice had already yielded its first crop of cash. She stepped into the foyer with the practiced air of a family matriarch, but the wall of stagnant, humid air and the scene of absolute domestic paralysis that met her probably shattered her pleasant illusions within seconds. Terrance was slumped on the kitchen stool, his shirt drenched in sweat, and his face a dangerous shade of crimson as he fanned himself with a useless piece of junk mail, looking like a man defeated by his own kingdom. The house was no longer a sanctuary of luxury, but a chaotic, strained environment where the lack of digital connectivity had stripped my family of their daily distractions and their artificial comfort. Serena was sitting at the heavy dining table, her expression a mask of pale anxiety as she stared blankly at her silent smartphone, her thumbs twitching from the habitual urge to refresh her betting apps. There were no dramatic screams or hysterical tears, just a heavy sullen silence as she realized she was completely cut off from the gambling circles that defined her social existence. She looked older than 30 in that harsh daylight, her eyes darting toward Celia as if searching for a solution that didn't involve taking responsibility for the void I had left behind. Mom was pacing the kitchen floor, her footsteps echoing with a frantic, rhythmic uncertainty, while she stared at the mountain of unpaid bills that were no longer managed by my automatic payment systems. They were no longer the confident predators who had sat across from me at the dinner table. They were now just a collection of confused, overheated individuals. Celia's voice, which had been so sharp and authoritative when she was lecturing me about filial piety on Sunday night, was now pitched in a high, frantic tone as she demanded to know why the air conditioning was off. She was horrified to realize that the $1,600 rent check she expected to be sitting on the counter didn't exist, and neither did the niece she thought she could keep under her thumb. Unable to endure the heat or the mounting tension any longer, the four of them eventually crowded into Terrance's uninsured Cadillac and sped toward the nearest Starbucks, desperate for the cool embrace of free Wi-Fi and the ability to launch a digital counterattack. From the safety of my temporary refuge miles away, I watched as my notifications began to flicker to life, a relentless barrage of manipulative text messages and social media tags that painted me as a monster. Serena sent dozens of messages questioning how I could be so cruel to family, while Glenda pleaded with me to think of the family's reputation, and Terrance demanded I return the stolen equipment immediately. Celia even joined the fray, sending long passive-aggressive voice notes about the divine importance of family bonds and the dark karma awaiting those who abandoned their parents in their hour of need. Their desperation was palpable through the glass of my screen, a chorus of voices suddenly realizing that the resource they had spent years consuming without remorse had finally fought back. I waited until the noise reached a fever pitch before I decided to deliver the final crushing blow to their rapidly crumbling delusions of control over my life. I answered the phone exactly once when Terrance's name flashed across the screen for the 20th time, making sure to trigger the recording software on my laptop before I even spoke a word. I didn't let him shout. I didn't let him plead. I simply began to read the cold, hard figures from the financial reports I had unearthed during my midnight investigation. I recited the specific loan account numbers for the Cadillac, the exact dates of the forged signatures, and the $15,000 debt that had been tethered to my name to fund Serena's gambling addiction. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute, a sudden heavy void, where Terrance's blustering fury used to be, as he realized I had more than just a grievance, I had evidence of a federal crime. I ended the call without waiting for a response, and immediately sent a high-resolution photograph of the identity theft report I was currently drafting for the Reno Police Department and the Federal Trade Commission. The $1,600 you wanted from me, I suggest you use that to pay off the car loan and the gambling debts before the bank comes to tow the vehicle. I typed with a steady, unflinching hand. I finished the message with a warning that probably sent a collective shiver through the group huddled around the Starbucks table. If I hear from any of you again, or if I see a single new charge in my name, I won't just file this report. I will walk into the precinct and hand over the original forged documents personally. I hit send and felt an immense, soaring sense of power as the notifications finally went silent, knowing that for the first time in my life, I had made the predators afraid of the consequences of their own greed. Thursday morning arrived with a sterile, biting coldness that seemed to permeate the glass and steel lobby of the insurance firm where I had built my career. I stood behind the reinforced glass of the upper mezzanine, watching the security monitors as a familiar battered sedan pulled up to the curb with a reckless screech of tires. Within seconds, the tranquil atmosphere of the professional atrium was shattered by the booming, distorted voice of Terrance echoing against the marble floors like a rhythmic assault on decency. He wasn't alone. Celia was flanking him like a shadow of malice, her face twisted into a grotesque mask of grief that I knew was practiced specifically for this public stage. They began to wail about the supposed cruelty of a daughter who had stripped her elderly parents of their basic comforts and vanished into the night like a common thief. It was a calculated performance of victimhood designed to weaponize my professional reputation against me, as they shouted for anyone in the building to hear about my alleged betrayal of the family bond. As the crowd of my colleagues and clients began to gather in hushed, curious circles, I felt a strange, icy calm settle over my heart, a lack of fear that only comes when the truth is finally ready to be unveiled. I walked toward the elevators with Brooks at my side, his presence a steady, unshakable pillar of support that shielded me from the waves of anxiety trying to claw at my resolve. When the doors opened onto the main lobby, the air felt thick with the scent of cheap tobacco and desperation radiating from the two people who shared my DNA, but none of my integrity. Terrance lunged forward the moment he saw me, his fingers shaking as he pointed at my face, accusing me of stealing the very technology that I had paid for with years of my life. Celia joined the chorus, her voice a sharp, piercing blade, as she demanded I hand over the keys to the digital kingdom I had reclaimed in the dead of night. Before they could escalate their aggression further, Brooks stepped between us, his posture radiating a professional authority that silenced their shouting with the mere weight of his gaze. He calmly opened a thick leather-bound folder and began to lay out a series of documents on the reception desk, each one a hammer blow to their rapidly crumbling performance. He produced original receipts for every single piece of hardware I had removed, clearly proving ownership in my name, followed by detailed logs of the fraudulent debt Terrance had tethered to my identity. Then, with a cold, surgical precision, he served them both with a temporary restraining order, a legal barrier that transformed their proximity to me into a criminal violation. The shock on Dad's face was almost pathetic, his blustering fury evaporating as he realized that the selfish daughter he had tried to exploit was now protected by the very laws he had so casually broken. I looked directly into Celia's eyes, seeing the flickering shadows of panic as I produced the final set of documents from the folder, a comprehensive report detailing her involvement in an illegal cryptocurrency Ponzi scheme. While they were busy plotting to steal $1,600 from my monthly paycheck, I had been documenting her predatory business practices and forwarding them to the Nevada Secretary of State. I revealed to the gathered crowd that my loving aunt had been using our family home as a base to recruit vulnerable victims into a fraudulent investment ring that had already ruined dozens of local families. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking fragile and ancient in the harsh fluorescent lighting as the web of manipulation she had woven finally began to entangle her own limbs. She tried to stammer a defense, a weak and desperate lie, but the sound was drowned out by the sudden rhythmic heavy tread of law enforcement officers entering the lobby. 2 Reno police officers moved with purposeful intent through the shocked onlookers, their eyes fixed solely on Celia as they produced a warrant that I had spent the last 48 hours ensuring was executed. I watched in a state of somber, detached clarity as they turned her around and clicked the cold steel of handcuffs onto her wrists, her cries of innocence falling on deaf ears. Terrance stood frozen in a state of catatonic humiliation, his jaw slack as he watched his partner in crime being led away in disgrace in front of my entire professional circle. The security team, taking their cue from the police, moved in on Dad, their hands firm, as they guided him toward the exit with a finality that signaled the end of his reign of terror. He didn't look back. He couldn't, as the weight of his public exposure finally crushed the last remnants of his arrogant facade under the weight of my hard-won justice. 3 months later, the vibrant electric glow of Las Vegas pulsated beneath my penthouse balcony like a living ocean of neon possibilities. I stood high above the desert floor, the dry wind no longer carrying the suffocating weight of Reno's manipulation, but instead smelling of fresh opportunities and the raw, exhilarating scent of absolute freedom. After the final confrontation at my old office, I had spent several tense weeks hiding in a secure apartment Brooks arranged for me, finishing my legal obligations while quietly negotiating a transfer to this senior position. Leaving Reno wasn't just a change of scenery, it was a strategic evacuation from a battlefield where I had finally emerged as the sole victor. I looked down at the digital notification on my phone, a simple confirmation that the final payment on my $52,000 student loan had been processed, officially clearing the last financial shackle from my name far ahead of schedule. The news from the north, however, painted a much darker and more desolate picture of the ruins I had left in my wake after that fateful Monday night. The luxury Cadillac CT5. The very symbol of Dad's stolen pride had been publicly repossessed by the bank after he failed to provide proof of insurance or a single monthly installment. Without my invisible subsidies, the family's true financial fragility was exposed, like a decaying carcass, leading to the inevitable foreclosure of the house due to massive arrears in property taxes. Terrance and Glenda had been forced to retreat from the neighborhood they once looked down upon, settling into a cramped, dilapidated trailer park on the dusty outskirts of the city. I heard that Mom spent her days in a state of perpetual shock, unable to navigate a world where her utilities didn't stay on by magic and her bills didn't disappear through someone else's labor. Serena's fall was perhaps the most poetic, as the 30-year-old was finally forced to trade her blackjack cards for the heavy, soul-crushing labor of a warehouse loading dock. Without my support for her family plan or her car insurance, she was drowning in the debts of her own, making her hands now calloused from lifting boxes to pay off predatory lenders who didn't care about her excuses. As for Celia, the legal system had been swift and unforgiving regarding her cryptocurrency fraud, ensuring that her predatory influence was locked behind cold steel bars for the foreseeable future. They had tried to consume my future to fuel their delusions, but, in the end, they were only consumed by the reality of their own greed and the consequences of their choices. Every time I thought about them, I didn't feel anger or even a lingering sense of betrayal. I simply felt a profound echoing silence, the kind that follows the removal of a tumor that had been poisoning the body. As the midnight hour approached, I took a small faded photograph from my pocket, the last physical link to the people who had tried to sign away my life for $1,600. It was a picture of a smiling family that never truly existed, a polished facade hiding the rot of entitlement and the coldness of parasitic hearts. I didn't hesitate as I let the paper slip from my fingers, watching it drift into the dark abyss above the Las Vegas Strip, until it was swallowed by the shadows and the neon glare. I turned back toward the warmth of my living room, where Brooks was waiting with a celebratory toast, and I felt a soaring sense of peace that I had never known in 26 years. I realized then that I didn't owe them a single cent, nor did I owe them my guilt, or a second of my precious attention ever again. I didn't owe them $1,600. I owed myself the beautiful, unburdened life of freedom I was currently living. Standing there, I finally understood that family is defined by the respect and loyalty we show one another, not just by the blood that flows through our veins. I learned the hard way that financial independence isn't just about money. It is the strongest shield we have against those who would try to steal our future. I realized I was never obligated to set myself on fire just to keep people warm who had caused their own bitter cold, and that while justice can sometimes be slow, the truth remains the ultimate weapon against exploitation. This journey taught me that choosing your own survival isn't selfish, it is a necessary act of courage when those who should love you only want to consume you. Thank you so much to all the wonderful listeners who have stayed with me until the very end of this journey. Your support means everything as I continue to share these tales of resilience. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to draw a line in the sand to save your own life? Please share your stories with me, as your courage might just be the inspiration someone else needs to hear today.